The chamber had been silent for 11 seconds before Ambassador Vale Torin realized something was wrong. Not wrong in the diplomatic sense, not the comfortable wrongness of procedural violation or contested translation matrices. Wrong in the way a predator's instinct signals wrong, before the mind has processed why. The 11 Terran delegates sitting across the conclave table had not reacted to the ultimatum. They had not consulted each other. They had not reached for their communicators or activated their legal counsel interfaces. They had simply gone quiet in a way that felt less like shock and more like recognition, like they had been waiting for exactly this moment. Vale Torin was a senior arbitration officer for the Galactic Conclave, 47 years of interspecies negotiation, 7 contested planetary disputes, and the only living member of his species to have successfully brokered a ceasefire between the Drevathi and the Korun Merchant Collective. He understood silence. He catalogued its varieties the way a physician catalogues symptoms: the silence of confusion, the silence of insult, the silence of surrender. This silence did not belong to any of those categories. The lead human delegate, a woman named Dr. Mara Solano, whose official title was Director of Interspecies Strategic Compliance, which had always struck Vale Torin as an oddly combative way to describe a diplomat, finally looked up from the table's surface. She wasn't looking at the ultimatum document still glowing in the air between them. She was looking at him, just him, not the conclave panel. Not the enforcement representative seated in the observation tier above, just him. And she said very quietly, before we respond formally, I want to ask you something personal, Ambassador. Vale Torin felt something shift in his chest cavity, a pressure adjustment his species associated with uncertainty. That is irregular, Director Solano. I know. She folded her hands on the table. They were steady. How long have you been studying Earth? He did not answer. Because the honest answer, 41 years, would have raised a question he did not yet have the language to answer. Why, given 41 years of study, he still did not fully understand what he was looking at. The ultimatum had seemed straightforward 3 weeks ago when the Conclave Security Committee had drafted it. Earth had been a provisional member of the Galactic Conclave for 6 years. In that time, the Terran Confederation had consistently resisted the Weapons Harmonization Treaty, the foundational agreement requiring all member civilizations to register, disclose, and cap the development of offensive armament systems. Every civilization joined the treaty. It was not optional in any practical sense. The Conclave's enforcement apparatus was the most sophisticated in the known galaxy, and no single civilization had the capability to resist it. The treaty's architects had designed it specifically to prevent the kind of arms race that had collapsed 3 previous interstellar civilizations in the Varanthi cluster. It worked by creating total transparency. Every registered weapons system, every research program, every military installation, all of it disclosed, cataloged, and capped at thresholds determined by the Security Committee. The logic was irrefutable. Civilizations that revealed their armaments to each other had no reason to fear each other. Civilizations with no reason to fear each other did not build weapons they didn't need. Civilizations that didn't build weapons they didn't need didn't start wars. The humans had participated in exactly none of this, not from hostility, or at least, not obviously from hostility. They had signed the treaty framework. They had attended every compliance review. They had submitted what appeared to be honest documentation of their registered military assets. But for 6 years, the Security Committee's verification teams had been unable to reconcile Earth's submitted figures with the energy signatures, manufacturing outputs, and resource allocations visible from independent monitoring systems. The numbers didn't add up. The gaps were not small. The gaps were of a magnitude that, in Vale Torin's 47 years of experience, he had only seen in civilizations that were secretly preparing for war. And so the ultimatum had seemed clear enough. Submit to full spectrum inspection, or face suspension of conclave membership and confiscation of all non-compliant systems under Security Provision 7. What had not seemed necessary, before this moment, was to understand why the humans had been quiet for 11 seconds in a way that felt like recognition. Mara Solano had been 12 years old when Earth made first contact with the Conclave. She remembered watching the broadcast from her grandmother's apartment in Lima, the enormous ship hovering over the Pacific, its hull a color that didn't quite correspond to anything in the visible spectrum she'd been taught to name, the translated words scrolling across every screen on the planet. "We have observed your world. You are invited to join the community of civilized species." She remembered her grandmother not moving for a long time after the broadcast ended. Not from awe, her grandmother was not easily awed, but from something more careful. Finally, the old woman had said in Spanish, something that translated roughly as, "Ask them what it costs." Mara had been thinking about that sentence for 20 years. She'd studied xenopolitics at Universidad Nacional before being recruited by the Confederation's new Interspecies Relations Department. She'd spent 3 years in translation work, then another 4 in intelligence-adjacent compliance analysis, a deliberately vague title for a department whose actual function was understanding what other civilizations said when they thought they were speaking privately. Not surveillance in the crude sense. More like listening to what the architecture of language revealed about the architecture of thought. The conclave species were extraordinary thinkers. Complex, nuanced, evolved over millennia into systems of governance and philosophy that made earthly institutions look primitive by comparison. But they shared something that Mara had taken 2 years to identify and another year to verify, and which had become the load-bearing pillar of everything the Confederation's strategic planning had rested on since. They were optimizers. Every conclave species, in every context Mara had studied, made decisions by identifying the optimal solution to a defined problem and pursuing it. Not because they lacked imagination. The Korun merchant collective's aesthetic culture alone was proof that imagination existed in abundance, but because their civilizational structures, over hundreds of thousands of years, had evolved toward convergence, toward consensus, toward the idea that there was a best answer, and that finding it was the primary obligation of governance. This made them brilliant. It also made them, in one very specific way, predictable. Because the thing about optimization is that it requires a stable model of the problem. And the thing about humans, the thing Mara had spent years trying to explain to her superiors, who kept asking her to put it in a briefing that was under 20 pages, was that humans did not have a stable model of themselves. She watched Vale Torren's equivalent of a frown cross his face as she waited for his answer about how long he'd been studying Earth. "The formal study period," he said carefully, "began at first contact." "That's not what I asked." Another silence. Shorter this time, but different in texture. "The conclave's preliminary observation of Earth," he said, "began approximately 900 years before first contact." Mara nodded. She had suspected something in this range. She had not suspected it was quite this long. She kept her face neutral with the specific kind of effort that feels like holding something heavy at arm's length. 900 years, she repeated, and you still felt you needed to issue this ultimatum. Director Solano, I'm not criticizing, I'm noting. She glanced at the other members of her delegation. None of them had moved. If you've watched us for 900 years and you still don't know what you're looking at, then something about your observation method is wrong, and I'm concerned that the conclave may be about to act on conclusions drawn from 900 years of incorrect methodology. Vale Torren filed a detailed report that evening. He included the 11-second silence. He included the question about the observation period. He included his own uncertainty about what any of it meant. His supervisor, Senior Director Melvin Orris, reviewed the report and dismissed most of it as diplomatic posturing. But she flagged one detail. The human delegate had said, "I'm concerned," and according to the translation matrix, had used a linguistic construction that in Terran language did not mean "I am worried for you." It meant something closer to "I have already begun preparing for the consequence of your mistake." Melvin Orris added a note to the file: "Escalate monitoring of Terran strategic communications. Increase inspection team to 12 members. Proceed with confiscation order if compliance is not received within 14 days. She did not adjust the timeline. She did not revise the strategy. 14 years in conclave administration had taught her that civilizations issued warnings. Civilizations made dramatic statements in negotiating chambers. Civilizations did not, in the end, actually refuse the Security Committee. She closed the file and moved to the next one. On the 8th day of the 14-day window, the first inspection team arrived at Terran Orbital Station Kepler-7. There were 12 of them, Vale Torin among them, because Melvin Oris believed his relationship with Solano might be useful. They were met by a single human officer named Lieutenant Commander Declan Okafor, who was wearing what appeared to be a standard-issue Confederation military uniform, and who greeted them with professional courtesy and absolutely no visible anxiety. This was, Vale Torin noted privately, already wrong. He had conducted 17 weapons inspections in his career. The emotional signature of the receiving party was almost always the same, a careful performance of cooperation layered over barely contained tension. It was natural. You were being inspected. The inspectors had authority over your future. The anxiety was normal. Okafor did not have it. He was not performing calm. He appeared to actually be calm, in the specific way of someone who has already finished being afraid of a thing and moved on to the next stage of whatever process fear was part of. He took them through 3 inspection bays, all of which matched the submitted documentation precisely. He answered every question. He provided access to every system they requested. He offered refreshments that the team politely declined. At no point did he check a communication device. At no point did he appear to consult anyone. He moved through the station like a man on a walk he had taken many times before. On the 3rd inspection level, one of the team's analysts, a Korun specialist named Deveth, pulled Vale Torin aside and said quietly, "These systems are authentic. They match, but they're old." Old how? Old in the sense of. Deveth paused, which was unusual for Korun, who were not a species that hesitated in technical descriptions. In the sense that, given the manufacturing outputs we've recorded from Earth over the past 12 years, this equipment represents approximately 4% of what should exist if it were all being used for what the documentation claims it's being used for. Vale Torin looked at the clean inspection bays, at the precisely catalogued weapons systems. At Okafor standing 15 meters away, not looking at them, examining something in the middle distance with the patient expression of someone waiting for an obvious conclusion to be reached. "Where is the other 96%? Vale Torin asked. Deveth said, "I don't know, that's what concerns me." On day 9, Mara Solano formally responded to the ultimatum. The response was 23 pages and had been drafted. She later told Okafor over a private channel, in the deliberate style of conclave legal architecture. The dense, recursive, precedent-heavy language that made conclave documents nearly impossible to read quickly. The response argued, in exhaustive detail, that the Weapons Harmonization Treaty's definition of offensive armament system was constitutionally incompatible with a category of human technology that did not have an equivalent in any conclave language, and for which, therefore, no compliance framework could exist until a definitional working group had been established under Article 14 of the Treaty Implementation Protocols. The category she was describing was not named in the document. It was referred to throughout only as Legacy Adaptive Infrastructure. The Security Committee's legal team spent 4 days analyzing the document. They identified the argument as technically valid but procedurally delaying. They were preparing a counter document that would force the definitional question back into the compliance window when one of the junior analysts, a young Varanthi legal apprentice named Sara, asked a question that nobody in the room immediately knew how to answer. She asked what exactly legacy adaptive infrastructure meant, not in the treaty sense, in the literal sense. Nobody knew. The phrase appeared nowhere in any prior Terran communication. It had been coined specifically for this document. And when the legal team ran it through standard translation matrices, They got results that didn't converge. Each matrix produced a slightly different meaning, ranging from inherited flexible systems to adaptive remnants of prior industrial development to, in one outlier translation that Sarah flagged with a small note of concern, the things we made before we knew we would need them to fight. The legal team submitted their counter document. They did not escalate Sarah's flag. They were very busy. HFY found Mara in the observation module at the aft end of Kepler 7 on day 10. She was watching Earth, a view that never got ordinary no matter how many times you had it. The curve of it, the impossible blue, the fact that it was just there, floating, containing 8 billion people who mostly had no idea that the next 4 days would determine something about their future that could not be undone. The second team lands on the surface tomorrow, HFY said. I know. He stood beside her. He was a large man, not unusually so for a former Confederation Marine, but large in the specific way of someone who had spent years in environments that required managing weight and mass, and the physics of his own body as variables. He looked at Earth the way Mara did, which was to say with the particular expression of someone looking at a person they love who is standing closer to an edge than they would like. Do you think they'll find anything? He asked. They'll find exactly what we've shown them. And the rest? She was quiet for a moment. Outside the Terminator line, the boundary between Earth's sunlit and dark hemispheres was moving in that slow, inexorable way that reminded you the planet was always turning whether you noticed or not. My grandmother used to say, Mara said, that the most dangerous thing you can do in a negotiation is let the other side think they understand you. HFY nodded. And the second most dangerous thing, let them think they don't. He didn't say anything for a while. Then, the committee is going to vote on enforcement next week regardless of what the inspection teams find. You know that. Yes. And you're not going to stop them. She looked at him. No, I'm going to let them try. Something in his expression shifted, not fear exactly. Something adjacent to it. The expression of a man who has heard a plan and understood it and wishes in some small, underfed part of himself that he didn't. How many people know? He asked. Enough, she said. Not too many. And the ones who don't know will be fine. She turned back to the window. That's the part the conclave can't model. They're optimizers. They need to know the full shape of a plan before they commit to it. They need every variable accounted for. She paused. We've been building things for 900 years without knowing exactly what we'd need them for. We just built because we're not sure, because we're never sure, because not being sure is. She stopped. It's what we do, HFY said. It's what we are, she said. The enforcement vote happened on day 14 as scheduled. 13 members of the Security Committee voted to proceed with confiscation under Provision 7. 2 abstained. 1 Vale Torin voted against, citing insufficient understanding of the situation which was noted in the record and ignored in the outcome. 6 hours later, 3 conclave enforcement vessels entered Earth's orbital space. They were large ships. Not warships in the conventional sense. The conclave did not send warships to enforcement actions, because enforcement actions were not wars. They were administrative procedures. The ships were equipped with enough applied force to, if necessary, physically disable non-compliant systems and remove them for transport to conclave secure storage. This had been done precisely twice in conclave history, and both times the civilizations in question had submitted to compliance rather than suffer the indignity of physical enforcement. The ships took up standard enforcement formation. Earth did not respond. The fleet commander, a Dravathi officer named Thresh Kavan, sent the standard administrative notification of enforcement intent, as required by treaty. Earth acknowledged receipt. Earth did not dispute the authority of the action. Earth did not issue a countermanding order. Earth sent one communication. It was from Mara Solano, and it was addressed personally to Thresh Kavan, and it said, Commander, before you proceed, I want to make sure you have complete and accurate information about what you're attempting to confiscate. Please review the attached technical briefing. The decision to proceed is entirely yours. Thresh Kavan reviewed the briefing. It was 47 pages. The first 12 pages were a technical inventory of the registered weapons systems on the submitted documentation. Systems the inspection teams had already verified. The next 8 pages were a detailed explanation of the Weapons Harmonization Treaty's definitional frameworks, specifically the section on what constituted an offensive armament system versus a passive infrastructure asset. The next 15 pages were something Cavan did not immediately understand, because they appeared to describe systems that did not match any technology category in the Conclave's comprehensive archive of known civilizational capabilities. The systems were not weapons. They were not described as weapons. They were described, in the same oblique language as the legal document, as legacy adaptive infrastructure. But they were distributed across the planet's surface, and beneath it and in orbit, in numbers and configurations that, and this was the part that caused Cavan to stop reading and call Vale Torin directly, would have required Earth to begin constructing them approximately 700 years before first contact. Which meant, Cavan said, that humanity had been building them before they knew the Conclave existed. Vale Torin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do the systems do?" Cavan said, "That's what the last 12 pages are about. And Ambassador, I need you to read them carefully, because either this document contains an error of translation, or humanity has been doing something for 700 years that we have no framework to understand." Vale Torin read the last 12 pages 3 times. Each time, his understanding of what he was reading changed, but not in the direction of clarity, in the direction of depth. Like looking into water that kept revealing itself to be deeper than it appeared. The systems described were not weapons in any sense the Conclave recognized. They didn't generate energy in offensive patterns. They didn't propel projectiles or emit directed radiation or disrupt molecular structures. They were, in the technical sense, entirely passive. They were, in the technical sense, infrastructure. But infrastructure for what was the question that the document did not answer, and that the document, Vale Torin slowly realized, was specifically designed not to answer. Because the 12 pages describe the systems in the way you describe a tool when you want the reader to understand the tool's capability without revealing its purpose. Like describing a net by listing its thread count, its tensile strength, its surface area, its material composition, everything true, everything verifiable, without saying what you intended to catch in it, he called Deveth. The manufacturing outputs, the 96% we couldn't account for. Yes. Could it have been used to build infrastructure rather than weapons? A long pause. Deveth was running calculations. Yes. If the infrastructure were distributed correctly, if it were embedded in natural geological structures rather than constructed above them, yes, the outputs would look identical. How long would it take to build what's described in this document if you began from scratch? Another pause. Longer. Assuming the manufacturing rates we've recorded over the past 12 years, which are themselves higher than we previously modeled, from scratch Deveth, 400 years, minimum. Assuming every manufacturing resource on the planet were allocated exclusively to it. Vale Torin looked at his own hands. The document claims construction began 700 years before first contact. The line was silent. Which means, Vale Torin said, because someone had to say it, they were building this before they had the manufacturing capacity to build it in 400 years, which means they built it over a period that could have been much, much longer. And the document won't say how long. Deveth said very quietly, "Ambassador, if they've been building continuously for a very long time, if this has been a civilizational project across multiple generations without a defined endpoint, without a specific enemy in mind, then that's not weapons development. That's something else entirely. That's—" "I know what it is," Vale Torin said. He just didn't have a word for it in his language. The closest concept was something like preparation without a target, a logical impossibility in his civilization's framework, because you prepared for specific threats, not for the unspecified future. You didn't build a net before you knew what you were fishing for. You didn't dig foundations before you knew the shape of the building. Except, apparently, humans did. Humans did precisely that across centuries, across generations, without any formal directive or governing body ordering it done. They built because they were humans, and humans, somewhere in the architecture of their civilization, had decided, Not once, not in a council, but repeatedly, independently across centuries, that the future was going to require something, and they didn't know what, and that uncertainty was not a reason to wait. On day 15, one day past the enforcement deadline, Cavan gave the order to begin confiscation of registered weapons systems at the nearest verified installation. 3 enforcement drones approached Kepler-7's weapons depot at 600 Universal Time. They stopped 2 kilometers from the depot. They stopped because every system aboard them, navigation, propulsion, communication, had simultaneously ceased to function in a way that was not damage and was not jamming and was not anything in the Conclave's catalog of interference methods. The systems had simply paused, all of them, at the same moment, as if they had each independently decided to wait. Cavan spent 40 minutes trying to understand what had happened. Then he received a communication from Mara Solano. "Commander," she said, "the legacy adaptive infrastructure I described in the briefing has a passive monitoring function. It's not a weapon. It doesn't damage anything. It interfaces with sufficiently advanced computational systems in the local space-time vicinity and introduces what I would describe as a very brief moment of consideration. Your drones will resume function in approximately 20 minutes. Cavan stared at the communication. "What does that mean? A moment of consideration?" "It means," Mara said, and her voice had no triumph in it, no satisfaction, nothing that could be called gloating, only the careful tone of someone explaining something they have thought about for a very long time, that your drone's computational systems were briefly given the complete operational history of everything in the immediate vicinity. Every system, every record, every structural element, not interpreted, not analyzed, just given instantaneously." She paused. "The consideration is the moment it takes for a system to begin processing information that exceeds its modeling parameters. You're saying you overwrote their systems." "No, I'm saying we showed them something. We can't control what they do with it." The drones resumed function 19 minutes later. They did not approach the depot. Their navigation systems had plotted a return course to the enforcement vessels and were executing it without any command being issued. Cavan demanded an explanation from his technical team. The technical team spent 3 hours analyzing the drone logs. Their conclusion was that the drone's autonomous decision systems, the fail-safe protocols that governed independent operation, had processed the information download from the human infrastructure and had determined that proceeding with confiscation represented an unacceptable risk of triggering a cascading systems failure in the enforcement vessels. Not because the human infrastructure was a weapon, not because it had threatened them, but because after the download, the drone's autonomous systems had modeled the local operational environment and had concluded that they did not fully understand it, and that proceeding in an environment you did not fully understand was a risk their fail-safe protocols classified as unacceptable. The human infrastructure had not stopped the drones. It had shown them the truth of the situation, and the drones had stopped themselves. Vale Torin read the technical team's report and then sat in the conclave ship's meditation chamber for approximately 2 hours, which was unusual behavior for him. He was not, by nature, a person who needed to sit alone to think. He was the kind of thinker who processed in motion, in dialogue, in the friction of argument. He sat alone because he needed to be wrong privately before he could be wrong in front of anyone else. Because the report had contained one additional detail, a single paragraph tucked into the technical appendix, that had changed the shape of everything he thought he understood. The infrastructure's information download had included the drone's own construction records. Every component, every material, every assembly step. The drones had been shown themselves. And among their own construction data was a small notation that appeared in the records of several components, a material sourcing notation that indicated the raw materials had been extracted from deposits on the 4th moon of a planet in the Varus system. The 4th moon of Varus 3 was not a current mining operation. It had been an abandoned conclave extraction site, discontinued 600 years ago, but the component manufacturing dates in the drone logs were recent. Materials were from 600 years ago, which meant someone had been stockpiling materials from that site for 600 years before they were needed, which meant someone had known, 600 years ago, that these specific materials would eventually be needed for these specific components on these specific drones, which was, in any rational framework of civilizational behavior, impossible. Unless the humans hadn't known specifically, unless they had simply been collecting everything. All of it, every material, every capability, every piece of infrastructure and information and capacity they encountered, not for a specific purpose, not against a specific enemy, just collecting, just building, just preparing endlessly without defined endpoint or defined target because they were a species that had decided, somewhere in their long and extraordinarily violent history, that the future was going to need something, and they would rather have too much than not enough. He thought about 900 years of observation. He thought about all the data, all the careful analysis, all the models his civilization had built of Earth. He thought about how much of that analysis had assumed that human behavior was directed, that humans, like every other civilization he had ever studied, were optimizing toward a defined goal. And he thought about what it meant if they weren't, if they had never been. If humanity was not optimizing toward anything, if humanity was simply accumulating, indefinitely, without design, without limit, without the psychological need to know what they were preparing for. What did you do in a negotiation, in a confrontation, in an enforcement action? What did you do against something that had been getting ready for everything, indefinitely, without knowing it was getting ready at all? The Security Committee emergency session lasted 9 hours. Vale Torin attended and said almost nothing. He watched his colleagues process the information at varying rates and reach varying conclusions, none of which felt adequate. The dominant position was that humanity had demonstrated a sophisticated passive interference capability, and that a revised enforcement approach was needed, possibly with a larger fleet, possibly with shielded systems that could not be affected by the information download. Vale Torin waited until the discussion had exhausted itself before speaking. When he spoke carefully because he had spent the 2 hours in the meditation chamber choosing every word. I want to propose a different interpretation, he said. I want to propose that we have made a fundamental error in how we've understood what we're dealing with and that the error is not tactical, it's conceptual. He looked around the table, Thresh Cavan, Melvin Oris, the Security Committee representatives. All of them. We issued an ultimatum, he said. We told humanity to submit to inspection or face confiscation. The implicit assumption was that these were the two options, submission or loss. We built our entire enforcement framework on the idea that humanity would either comply or resist, and that resistance, like all resistance we have ever encountered, would be some form of escalation, force meeting force, systems against systems. He paused. What humanity did was neither of those things. Humanity showed us what they have, not as a threat, not to demonstrate superiority. They showed us because Director Solano said, and I believe her, that she wanted us to have complete and accurate information before we proceeded. She stopped our drones, someone said. She showed our drones the truth, Vale Torin said. The drones stopped themselves. Because when you show something that processes information honestly, the full and accurate scope of a situation it doesn't understand, and you give it time to consider, it will choose caution. That is not a weapon. That is, he searched for the word. That is pedagogy. She taught our drones not to proceed. She taught them by showing them the truth. The chamber was very quiet. And I believe, Vale Torin said, that is precisely what she has been doing with us, for 6 years, not hiding. Showing us the truth in increments we could absorb, waiting for us to understand something we kept refusing to understand. Melvin Oris said slowly, what have we been refusing to understand? That the weapons they registered are not their real capability, Vale Torin said, and that their real capability is not a weapon. The weapons they showed us are, he stopped. Then, they're the 4%. They're what humanity considers weapons. The rest, the legacy adaptive infrastructure, the 700 years of construction, all of it, humanity doesn't classify that as weapons because to them it isn't. To them it's just what a civilization does with time. You build, you store, you accumulate, you don't optimize, you don't define the purpose in advance, you just make. That's not a strategy, someone said. No, Veil Torin agreed. It's something older than strategy. It's what civilizations do before they have strategies. Before they have enemies, before they understand enough about the universe to know what to be afraid of. He looked at his hands again. Humanity never stopped doing that. They developed strategies. They built institutions. They joined the conclave, and they kept building. Everything they encounter, they examine it, they find what's useful, they add it to what they're becoming, without end, without a designed endpoint. The room was silent for a long time. Then Thresh Cavan said, if that's true, then confiscation is not possible. You can't confiscate something that a civilization is in the continuous process of creating because creating is what they are. No, Veil Torin said, you can't. Then what do we do? Veil Torin thought about Mara Solano looking at Earth from the observation module, the Terminator line, the planet turning. I think, he said, we begin by understanding that we are not in an enforcement action. We are in a first contact. Several people looked at him strangely. First contact occurred 6 years ago, Melvin Orris said. The first contact occurred 6 years ago between the Conclave and a provisional Terran Confederation, Veil Torin said. The civilization we are actually dealing with, the one that has been building for 700 years without a defined purpose, we are meeting it for the first time right now. And we have spent the first meeting trying to confiscate its things. Mara took the call from Veil Torin herself on a private channel without the rest of her delegation present. I need to ask you something, he said. Go ahead. The infrastructure, the 700 years of it, is it? He stopped, started again. Is there a plan? Is there a design? Does Earth have a defined strategic objective that all of this is oriented toward? She was quiet for long enough that he thought the channel had dropped. Then she said, my grandmother was a civil engineer. She built bridges. Her entire career, 40 years, was building bridges in a region of my planet with difficult geography. Mountains and rivers, hard terrain, people needed to get places. She paused. When she retired, someone asked her what her most important bridge was, the one she was most proud of, and she said, the ones that haven't been needed yet. Veil Torin said, I don't understand. She built bridges in places nobody needed to go yet, Mara said, because geography changes. Because populations move. Because a road that doesn't exist yet will exist. Because the bridge you build before you know you need it is the bridge that still stands when the need arrives suddenly, in the middle of a flood, and you have no time to build one then. She paused. She built 3 bridges in her career that nobody used for 20 years after she built them. Then all 3 of them became the most important crossings in the region. Veil Torin said nothing. He was thinking about a species that had looked at an empty universe and started building bridges. The infrastructure, Mara said, doesn't have a strategic objective. It has a principle. The principle is, she paused one more time. We have been afraid before. We have been afraid many times of each other, of our own history, of what we might become and of what might be out there. And we learned slowly that the only answer to being afraid of an unknown future is not to understand the future better. Her voice was careful and even and weighted with something that was not pride and was not grief, but was somewhere in the profound space between them. The answer is to be ready, not for a specific thing, for anything. To have built so much for so long with so many hands and across so many generations, that when the terrible unknown thing finally arrives, you have, already waiting somewhere, some bridge that happens to cross it. The channel held the silence between them. Director Solano, Veil Torin said finally, and something in his voice had changed in a way neither of them addressed directly. The Security Committee is going to want to know whether humanity intends to continue this accumulation indefinitely. Yes, she said simply, and the scale of it, whether it will expand. Yes, those answers are going to frighten people. I know, Mara said, they frighten me too, because I know what it means. She was quiet for a moment, and the quiet was the kind that comes before a truth, not after it. It means we will never be done. It means every generation inherits not just what was built before, but the obligation to build more without knowing why, without knowing for what. It means we are a civilization that has accepted permanent incompleteness as a condition of existence. We will never arrive at the endpoint because we refuse to name one, she breathed. That is terrifying, I know it is. It terrifies us. But you continue. We don't know how to stop, she said. We never learned. The Security Committee formally suspended the confiscation order 4 days later. The stated reason was procedural. The definitional working group on legacy adaptive infrastructure needed to be established before enforcement could proceed. The unstated reason, which Vale Torin included in a classified addendum to his report that was read by exactly 11 people and would not be declassified for 60 years, was that the Security Committee had looked at the full scope of what Earth had submitted in the technical briefing and had reached a consensus position that no enforcement mechanism currently available to the Conclave was adequate, not because of the infrastructure's passive interference capability. Not because of the numbers, though the numbers were staggering. Because of the principle. You could not enforce compliance against a civilization that was not pursuing a goal. Every treaty, every protocol, every enforcement framework the Conclave had ever designed was built on the assumption that civilizations behaved purposively, that they built what they needed and wanted what they needed and could be made to negotiate around what they needed. You could reason with need. You could redirect it, accommodate it, regulate it. You could not regulate accumulation that had no defined limit, because defining the limit was the one thing the accumulating civilization had specifically, deliberately, across 700 years and countless generations, refused to do. The Conclave's enforcement apparatus could confiscate weapons. It could not confiscate readiness. Mara did not celebrate. She went back to the observation module and looked at Earth again and felt something she could not have cleanly named to anyone who asked. Not victory, not relief, not pride. Something closer to sorrow mixed with certainty. The feeling of having been right about something you would have preferred to be wrong about. Akafor found her there again as she'd known he would. They're withdrawing, he said. I know. The working group will take years, maybe decades. I know. He stood beside her. Outside, Earth turned. Mara. His voice was different. I've been in the Marines for 18 years. I've served in 2 conflicts and 3 peacekeeping deployments. I've seen bad situations. He paused. I've never been part of something that scared me the way this does. She looked at him. Not because of them, he said quickly. Because of us. He nodded at the window at the planet. We've been building for 700 years without knowing why. We've told an entire galactic civilization that we plan to continue without limit, without endpoint. We've demonstrated that we will not stop because we can't stop, that it's in us, that accumulation, that refusal to define a boundary. He was quiet for a moment. Mara, what happens when we meet something that we've been, without knowing it, building toward? What happens when the bridge finally has someone standing on it and we realize what we built it for? She looked at Earth. The blue curve. The unfinished, turning, endlessly turning world. Then we find out if we built enough, she said. He didn't have an answer for that. She hadn't expected one. There wasn't one, not in the way comfort requires an answer to be. There was only the planet, and the 700 years, and all the generations who had built without knowing what they were building for, who had looked at an uncertain future and responded not with planning, not with optimization, not with the rational architecture of civilizations that had decided they understood the shape of what was coming, but with the only answer their nature allowed. More. Always more. Always another bridge in a valley no one had crossed yet. The Conclave would study Earth for another 900 years and still not fully understand what it was looking at. Vale Torin knew this with the certainty of a man who has touched the edge of something vast and come away not with answers, but with the permanent, humbling knowledge of how large the unanswered portion remains. He included one final sentence in his classified addendum, in a language his own species no longer used formally, an older tongue, from before they had become optimizers, from when they too had sometimes built things without knowing why. They are not the most powerful species in the galaxy. They are the only species that has not yet decided what it is becoming, and they are building for that becoming with every century, every generation, every quiet pair of hands that has ever added one more stone to a structure whose name no one has agreed on, and whose purpose no one will ever fully declare, because to declare it would be to limit it. And limitation is the one architecture humanity has never once, in all its long and violent and persistent and terrifying history, been willing to accept. The enforcement ships left orbit, the planet kept turning. And somewhere beneath its surface, in the geological dark, in the distributed quiet of 7 centuries of unannounced preparation, something that was not a weapon and was not a plan and was not a strategy, but was perhaps the closest thing the universe had ever produced to a civilization's deepest and most inarticulate prayer. Let us be enough. When enough is finally needed, waited, without urgency, without countdown, without any particular interest in being understood. It simply existed. Accumulated and patient and immeasurably old, ready for nothing specific, ready for everything.